Welcome everyone to this, what we think is an exciting webinar about improving the ROI for your EMV migration. And as everyone on the phone and in the industry is aware, the dates are creeping up very, very fastly. So I'm going to hand it over to our first presenter, Gilles Baraisis, here in a second. With me in the room is Dan Hyman, who is a solution consultant for ACI, and he is also on the EMV Migration Forum Committee as well. So Gilles Baraisis is a senior analyst at Salent. So Gilles, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paul, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much again for joining our webinar today. So let me jump straight into the agenda and say that I will start with about 20 minutes or so talking about the industry perspective. And after a few introductory remarks, I'll really focus the bulk of my conversation around the progress report on EMV migration in the U.S. I'd also close with touching briefly on what EMV impact is on the issuers. And then I'm going to hand it over to Dan, who will really talk quite a bit more about that subject and talk about how issuers can improve their EMV ROI. So just very briefly to introduce myself, as Paul said, my name is Gilles Baraisis. I'm a senior analyst at Salent. Just in case you don't know us, we are a research and advisory firm exclusively focused on the financial services industry. We're a division of Oliver Wyman, which is a major management consultancy firm. And as you can see from this page, with some of the reports that we've written, we have been covering retail payments extensively over the years. I've been writing a lot about digital payments, mobile, online, cards, about innovation in payments. And in fact, just today we've published a report on EMV migration in the U.S. And so you are actually one of the first people to hear about some of the findings from this report. So I'm sure if you're on this call, you probably know already a lot about EMV and what EMV is. So I don't really want to spend much time on this, but just in case, wanted to mention that essentially EMV is a technical standard that ensures chip-based payment cards and terminals are compatible around the world. So it's a payment card technology that has been around since '96, and as a result, actually has a very wide global adoption already. And I'll have a slide on that in a minute. EMV is really best known for its ability to reduce payment fraud, particularly from counterfeit and lost and stolen cards. Because it's a global technology, it also ensures global interoperability of the card transaction, which is really another important benefit. But it can do a lot more than that. It can improve risk management by giving issuers advanced capabilities to manage card behaviors in the field. It can support multiple applications on the same chip, and it also can lay the foundation for some of the innovative services, such as contactless mobile payments. So there are many good reasons for implementing EMV. And so, not surprisingly, quite a lot of the world has already done that. As you can see from this chart, globally, 45% of all cards, which is 1.6 billion of cards, are already EMV enabled, and over 75% of terminals are capable of accepting EMV cards. The figures, unfortunately, do exclude the U.S., because the U.S. really, so far, right now is actually the largest market in the world that's not yet accepting EMV cards and doesn't issue EMV cards, not at scale. UK is quite often given as an example of the type of impact that EMV can have on fraud reduction. And I'm not going to go through the numbers in detail in here, but we just wanted to point to you some of the effects here that we've seen in the UK. As you can see, between 2004 and 2005, there's been significant decline in UK bank card fraud rates for face-to-face transactions at UK retailers. And unsurprisingly, that coincided with a large-scale EMV migration. And as you can see from the chart, the fraud rates have continued to drop to the point where now the fraud is lower even in absolute figures than it was 10 years ago. And if you look at the fraud to turnover ratio, the drop is quite dramatic. It's nearly 60%, 57%. The thing about fraud, however, is that probably the most dramatic difference that you can see here is the extent to which fraud type has migrated. So it went from clearly counterfeit and lost and stolen card fraud has reduced significantly, but that came at the expense of increase in card not present fraud, card not present transactions, which are not really covered by EMV. And the reason for that is that fraud tends to migrate to the weakest link. So, which is really the biggest challenge for the U.S., because as the U.S. gets increasingly isolated, there is a risk that fraud levels will continue to rise. And as you can see from this chart here, those fraud rates have already been rising. And again, if you look at the past 7 years or so, the increase has been nearly 70%. Still, the numbers are not too scary at the moment. 8.5 basis points, that's still a relatively manageable number. And quite a bit of that increase is actually probably card not present transaction fraud. But the overall trend is clearly alarming for the industry. And in addition, we're having problems now where international travelers, both to and from the U.S., are starting to experience problems when using their cards. So when the U.S. cardholder goes to Europe, sometimes their cards are not accepted. Equally, when we from Europe come to the U.S., sometimes we have issues because our issuers actually decline the transaction. In fact, European issuers are now seeing U.S. as the largest source of counterfeit fraud for their cards. So they are increasingly wary about accepting the card transactions originating from the U.S. So unsurprisingly, basically the U.S. a couple of years ago started to make some significant decisions to move the industry towards the EMV. And so what I wanted to do now is share with you some of my thoughts around the progress so far. And clearly we have seen quite a bit of progress. And it's worth thinking about both the industry guidance type activities and industry responses. So in terms of industry guidance, we've seen network roadmaps, we've seen EMV Migration Forum that's been established. But in terms of industry responses, we've seen some increase in EMV card issuing, but it's still very, very little. Equally, there's some acceptance now at merchants and processes are ready, but again, the progress has been much, much slower than many had hoped. So just going into a bit more detail about this is that the main networks kind of have done their part. They actually all issued their own migration plans, and importantly, they've all aligned on key EMV migration milestones. And you can see here in this chart some of these milestones. Again, I just want to highlight probably the most important one, which is the October 2015, which is the time when counterfeit point-of-sale transactions liability shifts from basically to a non-compliant party. So if a party is not ready for EMV, they are essentially responsible for fraud on that transaction. There are some additional milestones, and some of those were already passed, such as acquirer compliance, for example, which was in April 2013. And kind of our indication is that while obviously the largest acquirers are compliant and had no trouble meeting that compliance, some of the smaller players are still struggling with their compliance efforts. The other thing that I'd really like to point out is that I think something that has been quite an important impetus to EMV migration in the U.S. is the EMV Migration Forum that really has done quite a lot of work to help promote EMV and coordinate activities across the industry. This coordination is absolutely critical, and it's really important. In the UK, when we did our migration, we had the same thing. The industry just came together and made sure that they agreed on how they're going to go about this and when the deadlines and the approach. And that coordination is absolutely critical. So EMV Migration Forum is playing a crucial role in really helping the industry to organize itself. And you can see from this slide some of the meetings that they've been having, the types of participants and the numbers of participants. And the thing is, it's really across the industry. Having said that, as I mentioned, the progress from the industry, in fact, has been quite slow. So some of the U.S. card issuers have already started issuing EMV-enabled cards, but it's been primarily credit cards, primarily aimed at international travelers. So you have the likes of American Express offering platinum and business platinum cards. Bank of America started rolling out those cards to corporate and commercial customers, and quite a few other major issuers, but also some credit unions starting to or planning to at least issue EMV cards. And some of the largest merchants also came out saying that they would like to support EMV. Walmart was probably one of the first ones. Best Buy, Home Depot, some of the other names that announced plans to become EMV compliant. But again, a lot of the smaller merchants have been struggling and have been continuing to ask questions about EMV. To me, this slide is really shows the kind of the story. If you look at on the left-hand side, are the numbers of the Visa EMV cards and how they've grown over the last couple of years. And the chart itself looks quite impressive. It went from 1.2 to 3.5 million. Having said that, that still represents only 0.5% of all Visa cards available in the market today. So it's still a long way to go until we have mass issuance of EMV cards. So why is such a slow progress? I mean, obviously, markets so large and so diverse as the United States, we're always going to take a long time to move to EMV. I mean, it's a massive effort, and it's a big and complex market. Having said that, what we see is really the 5 main reasons why we think the progress has been so slow. First of all, issuers are weighing up real costs against potential benefits, and there's been no mandate to migrate to EMV. The other thing is that we're having the situation that some people call it's a chip in choice. There's been lack of guidance and lack of agreements on standards, what the issuers have to do. Durbin and Judge Leon really threw a spanner in the wheels for debit, and we'll talk about that in a second. Merchants have also been resisting. They looked at their own numbers, at their own ROI, and they just don't see one. So they're struggling to see how EMV can benefit them. And finally, some people are saying, well, the technology has been around since '96. It's an old technology. Why do we have to invest into something like this? So let me walk you through a little bit more with some of these key arguments. The first one, the thing is that for issuers, the cost is certain. EMV cards are undoubtedly more expensive than traditional MagStripe cards. How much more expensive depends on a number of factors, and some of the numbers that you see are quoted in the industry. They vary depending on what's included in those numbers. But the fact is that EMV cards are at least 4 to 6 times more expensive than the MagStripe cards. On the other hand, the benefits are unknown and uncertain. Again, if you look at the numbers here that we have for debit loss rates, they are relatively manageable at the moment. And so the issuers are saying, well, if it's fine. If everybody migrates, both issuers and merchants migrate, surely the level of fraud would decline, so that's good news. If the merchants don't migrate, and then we do, then again, we can maybe shift some of that liability to the merchant. So that's good news as well. But we need to invest. It's going to cost us money. And guess what? By doing nothing, actually we continue to retain this liability, which is really a situation. So in that case, we only become worse off if fraud rises beyond the manageable level, which, yes, the trajectory is positive and it's in the upward trend, but so far those fraud levels have been manageable. And the other thing is that, as I already mentioned, there's really no mandate for either issuers or merchants to support EMV. The only mandate that we had in EMV migration plans from the networks was for the acquirers to be able to support EMV transactions. The issuers and the merchants are free to decide what it is that they want to do. And some of the things that are complicating those decisions are the fact that they have to make multiple choices around where and how they're going to implement EMV. Smart Card Alliance, which is one of the organizations really behind EMV and supporting EMV migration, they have this nice chart that shows all the different choices that the issuers have to make, whether they're going to authorize transaction online or offline. The same thing about authentication, whether they're going to issue contactless cards or dual interface. And probably the biggest question is around cardholder verification methods. Most of Europe is supporting chip and PIN transaction. transactions, whereas in the U.S. the actual the networks have expressed preferences and guidance, but haven't really specified a single solution for the industry. So if you look at Visa's guidelines, for example, Visa is saying we'll allow whatever the cardholder verification method that the issuer decides. So again, this chip and choice situation, well, sort of kind of makes sense given the complexities of the market. Doesn't necessarily make the job of the issuers easier when making those decisions. As I mentioned, Durbin really has, or Regulation II, has some important provisions that apply to all the cards and really kind of puts spanner in the wheels when it comes to EMV. I'm not going to go into the details here given the time, but the essence is that merchants need to have the capability to determine transaction routing and have at least two unaffiliated debit networks. The problem with EMV cards is that the application IDs, AIDs, they're kind of designed to support one network application only. So the question is, should the card have multiple AIDs? Could we settle on one AID that allows routing to multiple networks? And the industry has kind of started working on a lot of these issues, and then Judge Leon came in, where the judge ruled that actually the Fed implemented the Durbin Amendment incorrectly. And so the question is now whether we might have a situation where actually issuers will have to support two unaffiliated PIN networks as well as two signature networks, which of course would further complicate the situation for EMV migration around debit. Merchants are also very concerned about EMV, and they're concerned about costs first and foremost, and saying that actually looking at the numbers, ROI seems to be impossible for them, especially if you look just beyond the terminal replacement. Some of the people are pointing out to things like fuel stations not having sufficient bandwidth. Once you start replacing that, you need to rip up the station forecourts. And so, there are costs that add up very, very quickly. Quite a lot of merchants are also quite ignorant still around EMV, so they're clearly behind on education. And the other thing that merchants are concerned about is the decision not necessarily to go uniformly for chip and PIN. So they think that the continued presence of signature will confuse the market, and also signature doesn't necessarily do much for lost and stolen fraud, which is something that merchants are concerned about as well. Of course, ambiguity around Durbin stifles progress, and some of the merchants even go as far as saying, well, you know what, this whole EMV migration is really just a conspiracy of banks and card schemes against the merchants. And they kind of put it, they say, look, right now we have liability for signature transactions that actually sits with the issuers, and we pay the premium for e-commerce transactions. Now with EMV, you're now going to transfer this liability to merchants for brick and mortar transactions, and you're not doing anything to solve e-commerce issues. And as we've seen from everywhere else in the world, e-commerce is really gets hit when EMV gets implemented. So now we're going to getting hit twice. So what the merchants want, really, ideally, they would get rid of signature. They would want to have a consistent chip and PIN type experience. They want interchange relief. They want to solve e-commerce transactions. So they have quite a few arguably legitimate concerns around EMV as it is today. And then finally, the argument around EMV as an outdated technology. And it's true that there are, if you look at some of the latest trends around mobile payments, some of those technologies can now actually are proposing to either do away with actual cards at the point of sale, or at least sort of tokenize the cards, and you use different types of technologies such as mobile phones to make payments. Having said that, cards are going to continue to be around for a really long time. I don't think a lot of these mobile technologies, they're still going to take some time to gain traction. So EMV is a technology that has been adopted globally, and my view is that it would be important for the U.S. to get on board as well. So I think in terms of our own predictions for EMV in the U.S., my view is that EMV will come to the U.S., although I suspect that liability shift dates will be pushed out. And I don't have any inside knowledge or insider track from how the networks are thinking about this. But at one of the recent conferences, these actually indicated that the dates are being considered, and we should expect to hear from them soon. MasterCard so far has been standing firm, but the fact is that the lack of progress so far means that realistically the dates are probably unlikely to be met, particularly around Durbin. The other thing is I think that merchants will probably need more incentives to adopt EMV. So far they really had a stick, which is a liability shift, and the only carrot, kind of the incentive that they had, was the PCI relief, which I don't think is going to be sufficient. In the UK, for example, we had an interchange relief. Maybe some other incentives could help, whether that's through tokenization efforts to solve e-commerce problems or standardizing around chip and PIN. But clearly, I think merchants need more convincing to move to EMV. And issuers are going to take a segmented and gradual approach to EMV migration. While debit remains a big uncertainty, big bank migration, even around credit cards, is going to probably not work for most issuers. I've got this chart here, which kind of shows that really we're going to start, in my view, I think most issuers will start with basic EMV payment apps around credit cards in particular, starting with some of the priority segments such as international travelers, and start reissuing gradually all the cards, credit cards, when they expire, to kind of fill out the credit portfolio. And debit migration really remains uncertain at this stage, and I think we just need to wait to see how it shakes out with the regulation. Then, of course, once we have that, I think there will be issuers that will want to move to more advanced EMV capabilities, and they make use of scripting, multiple non-payment applications, and some of the other capabilities that Dan will talk about later on. So we'll be moving along the EMV sophistication axis here as well. So just before I hand over to Dan, just quickly wanted to run through some of the EMV impact on the issuers and what options they have available. As the issuers start planning their own EMV migration efforts, they really need to consider 5 major areas of impact. First of all, it's around card product management and marketing. There's a number of business decisions that the issuers need to make around customer segmentation, which customers will be receiving the EMV cards when, but also things like policies, card design, marketing messages. There's quite a lot of thought that needs to go into these new products, just because the product itself is a lot more complex. You can do a lot more things with the chip card than you could in the past with the MaxStripe card. But the design changes as well. For example, there is now a presence of chip. So what does that mean for your own branding, for the network brands, etc. In addition to that, you need to start looking at your systems. So the back office systems need to change in order to support new card personalization requirements. Data preparation becomes quite important because, again, the chip needs to hold a lot more data. And that data can be changed during the life cycle of the card itself. So you can manage the applications, you can manage the card, you can block and unblock the card. If you choose to go for PIN, you need to have PIN management capabilities. So all of that needs to be supported by your back office systems. And similarly, authorization systems also need to change because now the card, the way it authenticates itself, the way it you authorize the transactions, again, it's a very different situation in terms of cryptography management, in terms of some of the data that gets passed around. So again, there are certain enhancements that need to be made to both the back office and authorization systems. Customer service impact tends to be overlooked quite often, and it's really important to think about what kind of changes you need to make across the various different channels that deal with customers. So if somebody walks into your branch today and says, my EMV card doesn't work, would your branch staff know what to do? And would they have the tools to, for example, reset the PIN or do some basic tests and checks around the card? Finally, education and communication is absolutely crucial. And you need to think about different stakeholder groups here. Internally, customer education is critical. It's important that customers understand why we're going through this change, why they're getting this new card. But equally, you probably don't want to overemphasize the security aspects of the EMV card, because there's still going to be quite a lot of customers that will remain on MaxDrive for some time. So again, there needs to be a balance between the messaging here. I also want to emphasize the need to engage with vendors, because vendors are obviously a crucial constituency for you to help out with the EMV migration. But again, if all issuers decide to move at the same time, there's going to be limited capacity around the vendors. So better start engaging with them now and make sure that you're aligned with their schedules and have a solid plan on how you're going to migrate. And speaking of vendors, there's a question, of course, whether you should outsource or build EMV capabilities in-house. And that will clearly depend on a number of different factors, not least which is the starting point, how you handle the card issuing and management today, and what are your long-term plans around the capabilities as well. Outsourcing clearly has the benefits in the sense that it can look much easier. It gives you access to EMV know-how and capabilities quickly. It also gives you variable cost structure, so as you migrate and as you grow, you can grow with the business. But you're probably going to be more dependent on vendor schedules, and the question is that you should ask is what kind of flexibility you'll have, especially with ongoing card management, scripting, and things like that. In-house is clearly much more effort and higher cost up front, but potentially reduced time to market for new card products. You have increased ability to switch or use multiple card suppliers. And a really important thing is that your secure keys remain in-house as well, which is something that we haven't talked too much about on this call, but it's one of the things that, as I mentioned, cryptography is a really important issue. So the management of secure keys is something that all issuers should be thinking about. Thank you. And so at which point I'd like to hand over now to Dan, and Dan will talk a bit more about how can card issuers improve the EMV ROI. Thank you.
Thank you, Zil. This is Dan Hyman with ACI. So I don't really have any magic formula, unfortunately, for how you improve your ROI if you're an issuer. Given everything that Gilles has talked about, the task looks pretty daunting. However, we do have some ideas, and I guess some things to maybe expand your thinking around what EMV really means to you as an organization and as a card issuer, and how you can take advantage of EMV. So first of all, I think everybody understands that, there just is no ROI if you're looking solely at card fraud and eliminating card fraud. But as card fraud does continue to increase in the United States, because we are the last major developed nation to move it toward EMV, I do believe that there will be increasing pressures on U.S. card issuers, to look at EMV for fraud reduction only. And as Gilles mentioned earlier, we've got the justification based upon counterfeit card fraud, but I think we also have to look at things like lost and stolen. And for example, MasterCard making the push toward PIN, or at least a preference toward PIN, can not only help us reduce counterfeit card fraud, but also fraud from lost and stolen. And then there are some unique things we can look at, and I know in the EMF that they're looking at to help avoid some of the shift that we may see in the card-not-present fraud arena. Going all the way to having discussions about, contactless cards, and the day that the PC has a contactless NFC reader built into it, to where you can tap your card and basically eliminate card-not-present transactions, in which case the PC could actually authenticate the card and really eliminate that whole card-not-present fraud environment. So, what my gauge kind of shows here is that if you're looking at fraud alone, the return on investment is in the low category, but it's something we need to pay attention to moving forward. So where can you look to help increase your return on investment? Well, one of the areas I like to talk about is really engaging to take advantage of the power of the chip. In a magstripe world, there's limited static data on a card. With EMV and chip, there's so much more ability to configure the way the card's going to act and what the card will do for the consumer. And it's that communication between the chip and the smart terminal and that negotiation that's going to determine the customer experience. And if you take advantage of the flexibility of EMV, you can really start to create and differentiate card products during the data preparation process. Our experience around the world has been that the UK, the Canadian, even some of the Latin American banks that have now worked with EMV for a few years, where they started out initially issuing maybe 5 or 10 different product types, they've doubled that given the flexibility of what you can do with this smart chip and EMV programs. And so they've been able to create very specific card products to go out and attract very specific customer bases to improve their customer penetration and also to improve their market share. And if you're unfamiliar with kind of how the data prep thing works, well, I think we all understand that in a traditional magstripe world, your card management system today, when it comes time to produce cards, produces an embossing and magstripe data file that you send off to a card production facility and cards get produced. In this EMV world, there is this additional step of data prep, and really what's happening there is that there's all these parameters in these applications that have to be enriched. The data has to be enriched and now go off to the card production facility so that not only can the plastic be produced and the mag stripe, but now all the proper parameters can be loaded to the chip. And if you do in-branch instant issuance, the same thing has to occur there. So this data prep step becomes very important as you move forward. So what is data prep? Again, traditional card management systems handle things like we would all expect: limits, velocity checks, the PIN, the CVV, the CVC, really everything that goes on to the magnetic stripe. As Gilles mentioned, in the data prep world, there is key management. There are program management parameters that have to be decided upon. And all of that goes into enriching the data that eventually is going to go off to the card production facility to produce cards. It's really in this step where we see a lot of banks that have been very aggressive in taking advantage of EMV to differentiate themselves, where they've really learned how to go out there and produce many different types of card products personalized to meet specific market niche and market needs. For example, here in the U.S., we've got a lot of interest and we all think about contact-based cards, but there's a lot of interest in convenience-type payments and contactless. Many of the big merchants, especially some of the convenient fast food chains, really are focused on let's make that transaction as quick and as seamless as possible, because the more people we can get through our checkout lanes, the quicker, the more sales that is. You're going to prepare a contact card much differently than you'll prepare a contactless card. And being able to set those parameters differently inside the program that goes onto the chip is going to be where you really can differentiate yourselves from your competition as an issuer. We do know that through our work at the EMF Forum that in the U.S., we're probably going to have debit cards with multiple payment instruments or payment applications on them in the U.S. environment. We hope what we end up with is a single debit app for the U.S. That works for any of the debit networks and complies with Durbin and complies with whatever Judge Leon and that whole thing really turns into. But you're also going to have international apps on those cards. Because if Dan Hyman is issued a card by his bank and he uses it in the U.S., U.S. merchants and U.S. terminals and U.S. ATMs will probably recognize that U.S. debit ID, but if I take that card overseas, that AID and application aren't going to be recognized. So I'm going to need to have one of the international brand applications on my card potentially as well. And when you get into this kind of an environment and managing these multiple payment apps and differentiating the parameters that you're going to put on those cards for handling things like online versus offline PIN authentication, online versus offline transaction authorization, even parameters that are going to allow you to set floor limits as to when can a transaction be done with no CVM versus when do I want a PIN or a signature. You know, some of those are the areas where you're really going to be able to take advantage of, I think, the flexibility of EMV to create some very unique card products for different market segments and attract new cardholders, maybe really gain top-of-wallet status as you move forward. If we take one step forward and we think about lifecycle management, these cards are expensive in comparison to magstripe cards. And in the magstripe world, we've all become accustomed to, if a customer wants a change, we tell them to simply shred their card and we'll mail them a new one. You're not going to want to do that as often in this EMV world just because the cost of those cards is so much greater. The EMV specification and the EMV cards allow changes to be made to the card once they're in consumers' hands. And if you go into thinking about your long-term EMV strategy and thinking about the ability to actually change those cards once they're in the consumer's hands, we really think this is an area where you can move that needle yet again another notch up into the higher ROI realm for your cardholder base. So how does this work? You know, in a traditional environment, you can send scripts down to a card on the back of any transaction, potentially that maybe occur at your own ATMs if you're an issuer that also has a fleet of ATMs deployed. And some of the things you can do are illustrated in the slide here where you see the script examples. You can go beyond that, and it hasn't been adopted around the world quite yet very much, but the flexibility of the EMV specification also allows you to do things like add applications, or maybe if you've loaded multiple applications onto a card when you issued it, but you haven't enabled all those applications, you can actually go turn those applications on for the consumer. The idea here is that what you want to do is get yourself in a position to be able to really build up an insurance policy around these expensive cards you're going to put into consumers' hands and give yourself the ability to change that card, the behavior of the card, and the way the card can be used through things like scripting and lifecycle management. If we take one step further, and I know Gilles talked about mobile a little bit, and one of the things that I think the industry overlooks a little bit is the fact that, you know, EMV is a foundation for mobile. That EMV payment instrument that I create and load onto a chip onto a card can go onto a chip really anywhere, whether that chip is in a mobile phone, whether that chip is in a server in the cloud, it's in somebody's hosted wallet. These EMV payment instruments can really go anywhere a chip may reside. And so leveraging EMV toward mobile, I think, is one area where you can also look to really, again, help improve the ROI. And the one good thing about using EMV as a foundation for mobile is the fact that EMV is a globally interoperable standard. If you issue an EMV compliant mobile payment instrument, you can be assured that that's going to work no matter where you take that mobile payment instrument. So if we step back to a diagram I showed earlier where we talked about data prep, if you now look at the mobile world, what you're basically doing is you're taking that same payment instrument that you're creating in a data prep environment, and you are now simply loading that to a chip through these things called trusted services managers on a device, in a cloud, wherever the case may be. Now, the parameters will look a little bit different, but in essence, it's the same payment instrument. It could be the same U.S. debit application or the same Visa or MasterCard international card brand application that you're putting onto a chip, but now you're putting to a mobile device with a few different parameter settings. In the same way, if we look at scripting and changing programs that we talked about earlier, now if you look at that in the aspect of a mobile payment instrument, it actually becomes easier to deliver scripts and or program changes anytime that payment instrument and the mobile payment device are in reach of the over-the-air signal. So leveraging those things forward, you really start to, I think, build up a business case for a much stronger ROI for the cards and the payment instruments that you're going to issue to your customer base. But it really does take some planning on all of the issuers' parts to get there. This chart, what we like to do is just talk to clients about, there are advantages to outsourcing. There are some disadvantages to outsourcing things like data prep and lifecycle management. If you go into this with a broad perspective and looking at things from a perspective of, I want to manage my own security keys and my own security certificates that I use to issue my cards. I want to be able to change those cards when they're in the consumer's hands. I want to potentially leverage it for in-branch instant issuance and for things like mobile. A very simple data prep service that you can outsource to today may not expand to all of this capability where you really can see a strong return on your investment. And so that's all we ask for our clients to think about is really where do you want to go in the long run and what's your vision in the long term. And we do believe a strong vision toward all of the things we've talked about today really can help you build an ROI within your organization beyond just eliminating fraud. So thank you very much, and with that, I think we'll open it up for some Q&A.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks, Jill. This is Paul McMeekin here again. We have a couple of questions which came in by the chat panel, so if you do have any questions, feel free to send them to us. Let me pull them up here. So the first question is, what should you expect from your vendor if you're ready to proceed? I would ask you for that one, Dan.
Well, I think, as Jill pointed out, there's a lot of different, vendors involved in the process. Those of you who are clients of ACI, one of our payment engines, your payment engines need to be potentially upgraded or the EMV features turned on to be able to process a transaction. Your card manufacturer needs to be a part of the decision-making process if you are an issuer. If you're a merchant or a merchant acquirer, your point-of-sale vendors have to help you with the process of deploying devices that are going to be able to accept EMV, as well as get you through all of this application selection process that has to happen at the device. And then finally, the whole data prep thing. That is an area where we suggest you talk to people that really understand about data prep and lifecycle management and give you some advice there as to whether you want to outsource or bring some of that in-house based upon your vision.
Great, thanks, Dan. Second question, I think this one will be for you, Jill. You mentioned earlier about MasterCard and Visa and the potential for the dates changing. Can you expand on that any further where you heard it from? You said you don't have the inside track, but is there any public statements that they've made?
No, I absolutely don't have an inside track, and you should only read into this as a completely personal opinion, which is not necessarily based on any statements from the networks. I'm simply looking at the market, at the situation, and I'm thinking that it's going to be very difficult to meet the deadlines, especially around debit, considering the situation that we have around Judge Leon and all the complexities there. So the only thing that I have heard is as I said earlier during my presentation, is that one of the conferences I heard a Visa representative saying that potentially there might be some announcements coming out later from Visa on this. But again, that's not something that we've seen officially communicated to anyone.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that clarification. And either of you could answer this one, I think. Is there any markets which have went beyond basic fraud prevention and detection and moved on to more of the advanced ROI things, such as mobile?
This is Dan Hyman. I can mention real quickly, Canada has probably been one of our latest territories to make from an ACI customer base to make a move toward EMV in the last few years. We really do see the Canadians aggressively pulling together, especially the mobile networks up there now have formed some relationships with the banks to come up with a scheme whereby all of the networks are participating to allow banks to load EMV-capable mobile payment instruments to their phones and devices. In other parts of the world, things like contactless have definitely taken off for convenience-type payments and for vending machines and for even transit authorities where, you want to use a card, a chip-based card, basically, to just tap your way through a turnstile. So I do think, we've seen people move beyond just the fraud arena and are starting to take advantage of the capabilities of and the power of the chip.
Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is also is around this notion of multiple payment applications, and it's really been while the chip can support different types of applications. I think what we've seen is that the issuers tend to start with multiple payment applications, which is, as Dan mentioned, this is a very realistic scenario that the U.S. will have to go down to anyway, because it really comes down to acceptance. So because the terminals can accept payment applications, we see sometimes issuers certainly combining contact and contactless, but also in France, for example, there are issuers that are mixing up now debit and credit on the same card as well. I think moving beyond payment applications into non-payment, such as loyalty and others. Again, ICE is in the U.S. They themselves, they're starting to add loyalty capabilities to their to their tap capability, but it's been much harder to implement, and so that tends to be more limited to the community solutions, whether that's around universities or some recreation parks. There's been an example of that in Colombia, for example. So there are examples, but they're harder to implement because of the acceptance issues.
And I guess the other thing I would add, and again, this is part of some of the discussions that we're having at the U.S. EMV Migration Forum. When we have issuers and merchants sitting across the table from one another and collaborating at those forums, you clearly hear on the merchant side of things that you've got a broad base of merchants in the U.S. that want to do things like contactless. They want to enable mobile payments. As we heard Gilles mention, in order to eliminate counterfeit card fraud and also lost and stolen fraud, they want to use chip and PIN. This really creates some challenges for the issuers because then they have to ask themselves, well, what do I implement? Do I implement and issue cards that are dual interface for contact and contactless? Do I allow all CVM methods? Because I want my card to be top of wallet, and therefore, I may consider all of those things, especially for some of my most loyal customers, to give them the greatest capability that I have. And so I do think you'll see some innovation being pushed in the United States just based upon the unique markets that we are.
Great, and one last, we've got two questions left as we're running out of time here. One is given that the common US debit AID is yet to be defined and that many issuers already have a relationship with either Visa or MasterCard, why would anyone wait and not deploy a Visa or MasterCard AID now for debit, I'm assuming, and deal with the US common debit AID later?
You know, we actually have seen and heard of some smaller credit unions actually doing that today, kind of making a bet on the fact that, you know, maybe Visa or MasterCard will open up their applications and AIDs to support multiple networks. I think what you've got holding people back on is that, you know, some would argue that if there's only a single AID on that card, is that in compliance with Durbin? I would say it still can be, because really if, let's say, all there is a Visa app on the chip and the merchant doesn't want to route that transaction over Visa, can they turn that card around and swipe it and still have the access and the ability to route that transaction to any network that that BIN belongs to for that card? Yes, they can do that. I think it'll be interesting to see the wrangling that goes on over some of this, and finally what does happen with the Judge Leon ruling and what happens there. I will say at the EMF we do have a group of people working on a solution for that in case it is actually mandated that there needs to be both two PIN debit and two signature debit networks on a single card. They're working on the idea around a single application to support both those things.
Great. And the last question, which is a nice and easy one to answer, will you make the slides available online? Yes, we will send them to all attendees probably about 2 or 3 days' time. Once we get the full attendee list, we'll actually send the slides to you as well as some further information. So thank you for attending today. I hope you found it useful and have some new, fresh ideas to take back to your day-to-day job. And we look forward to continuing the conversation with you further. Thank you very much.